Chapter 28. The Long Night of Darkness. The rock beneath the fortress was honeycombed with caves and corridors, a melding of natural rock with mortared stone. The dungeon was a spacious and airy chamber, the cells consisting of bars that ran floor to ceiling. Haille felt very much like an animal on display as they each were placed in their own cage. Smoldering torches and long horizontal slits in the wall let in the light of the setting sun, creating ribbons of light cross-hatched with the shadows of bars on the walls surrounding them. Beneath one of these broken rays, Cody sat, hunched, weeping, unable to look up from his hands which glistened with his tears. The rest of them sat in silence. Val had his back up against the bars, his face turned up to the ceiling. By his expression, Haille could not be sure if their captain was thinking of a way out or reflecting on the events of his life as a man on the eve of execution might. But either way, Val's eyes had a faraway cast to them, and Haille knew better than to try to reach him. Chloe, who was in the cage next to Cody, stretched through the bars to comfort him. He moved to the edge of his cell and let her cradle his head as best she could, her forehead tilted in the direction of her shoulder, but meeting the bars instead. He did not seem to notice or care. The tears and shame flowed freely.
"I've been such a selfish fool," Cody said, sobbing. "Her name was Evangeline, and she was exceptional."
Chloe asked the question they were all wondering. "Why did you leave?" Cody sniffed and covered his face.
"Because I always do. Driven by some fear, some restlessness, some unfillableness."
Val volunteered from his cell. He had slid down to the floor, his back against the bars, his head tipped downward so that his chin rested on his chest.
"It is in all of us. We just try to fill it in different ways." "Captain," Cody said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know he would punish you too. I deserve this, but you deserve your friends beside you in the end."
"Val, we can't just give up," Chloe said.
"We can hope for clemency, but I don't anticipate that the Commandant will have a change of heart. He's a madman to murder his own daughter."
Gunther could not finish his thought.
"Virtue can often twist into vice in individuals prone to extremes,"
Adamantus said from his cell on the end of their row. It reminded Haille of an expression Yana had shared with him, about strengths being turned to weaknesses, but he could not remember it in fullness just then. No one slept. At best, Haille dozed. In a dark and dreary landscape, he imagined the soldiers coming for his friends, opening their cages and leading them away. He woke in the darkness of the night only to think, not yet. He listened to Caitlin cry and sniff throughout the night, and Cody speak of a father he had never known, and a mother who provided for him by entertaining men and their appetites. Chloe was his comforting solace, withholding judgment and replying to his admissions and sobs with, there. Val was quiet through the night, breaking his silence at one point to ask the elk,
"Do you know anything of the other side, elk?"
To which Adamantus replied,
"No, I'm afraid I don't. All those that I have known to have passed through that veil have kept their secrets to themselves."
Eventually, by the time the sky showed the lightning blue-gray of dawn, a dozen soldiers came down the steps and opened Cody's and Val's cages. In his dreams, Haille had already watched his friends taken away more times than he wanted, but no nightmare apparition had prepared him for the actual moment, the bile rising in his throat and the tears that blurred his vision.
"Listen to me," he begged the soldiers. "My father is King Talamar. I am Prince Haille Hillborn. We will absolve these men of their sentences. They are friends of the crown. There will be repercussions if they are hurt."
He could not bring himself to say the word killed, but the soldiers were unmoved. A younger one of the lowest rank, who trailed behind with the keys to the cell doors, lingered beside Haille's door as Val and Cody were led up the stairs.
Honor is everything to the Commandant, he said. If you are the prince, I am truly sorry.
Then do something, Haille implored, his hands tightening on the bars.
I can't, he said,
then shuffled away, running up the stairs to catch up with the other soldiers. Only after his footsteps faded did Chloe break down, weeping for her friends. She had been strong the whole night, and only now did the strain show. Gunther was in a cage across from her and out of reach, but he pressed himself against the bars to move as close to her as possible, his eyes deep pools of sorrow. The light in the window slits grew brighter and rosy. Haille hoped that at least it was a beautiful sunrise that greeted his friends on their last morning, while at the same time he hated the lightening sky and the passage of time, for all were reminders that Val's and Cody's time was coming to an end. The sound of feet descending down the steps broke them all out of their stupor. At first, Haille wondered if it was the courier, come to tell them their friends were dead, the execution complete, but who would move with such urgency to bring that message? Then he heard the jingle of keys, and wondered if the meek-faced jailer had returned after a change of heart. But no, the figure that stepped out of the stairwell was one he did not expect. Victor Twenge. Haille recognized his fair hair and fine-boned features immediately, even in the limited light. "Come to gloat, Twenge," Chloe said from the floor of her cell. Twenge snorted. "If only." He lifted the ring of keys from his belt, pushed one into the lock on Chloe's cell, and swung open the door. She stood up, her feet spread in a fighting stance. If Twenge had come to take her to be executed as well without reinforcements, he had grossly miscalculated. "Come on," he said, stepping aside from the door. "We need to get moving if we're going to escape." "What? You?" Chloe said, still unmoving.
"I stand for the law, for justice. This is neither. It is a vendetta."
He turned to Haille's cage, worked the key into the lock, and freed him.
"After all, more than a few folk believe this young man's story, Captain Ruane among them. He is waiting with the Swift Wind and a contingent of rangers. We just need to reach them. Time is of the essence."
To Haille's disbelief, Twenge moved from one cage to the next, releasing them, even the elk. "Where did you get the keys from?" Haille asked.
"Some fresh-faced young soldier of the fort. He practically tossed them to me. I barely had to threaten him. Not much of a jailer."
But a decent human being after all, Haille thought. Twenge led them to a storeroom where their weapons had been locked away, and they armed themselves before running up the twisting stairway. After a series of turns, they emerged on the battlements under a sky streaked with fiery dawn clouds. The walkway curved along away from them where it met the great folded arm of the windlass, its cage waiting, the operator's seat empty.
"The Swift Wind is below," Twenge said. "We just need to reach the windlass."
"Won't they try to stop us?" Chloe asked.
"Marsh has called everyone to the execution," he said with a grimace, then wiped his face with his palm. He could not meet their eyes as he spoke. "This is our only chance."
They had emerged behind the drum tower, and Haille stepped forward to peer around its edge, bracing himself for whatever he might witness. In the main yard, dozens of soldiers were gathered in square formations, not 100 men, but close. All faced the stage, which had been turned into a gory spectacle. 2 stumps had been anchored to the floorboards. A black-hooded executioner, his axe resting on its handle next to his foot, waited between them. Val and Cody were held before the chopping blocks by 3 soldiers each. His friend's eyes were fixed on the scarred, stained stumps and the baskets resting on the far side of them. Marsh was draped in black cloth, his face smeared in ashes like a mourner at a funeral, not Val or Cody's, but his own daughter's. In Marsh's eyes, Haille could imagine the fires of his daughter's pyre burning. Marsh was reading from a scroll, a long list of his daughter's virtues and Cody's vices. Haille noticed the curl of paper at the bottom was still thick. "It's a long sentencing," he said. "More of a diatribe," Chloe said. She had moved to the edge of the tower alongside him. He reached out for her hand.
Chloe, I know Val said you would be in charge if something happened to him. Then I ask you, is there anything we can do?"
Chloe drew back, her eyes moving from the execution stage to the windlass. She shifted to look between the balustrades at the swift wind rocking in the surf below. "He would want me to get you to safety, Prince."
"True, but if it were one of us down there, what would he do?"
Chloe bit her lip and balled her hands into fists. "We came together. We should leave together. But I have to get you to safety. You are the prince."
"But I have an idea."
Mounted on the back of the elk as he was, Haille could see over the heads of the gathered soldiers all the way to the stage, where the commandant was still reading the sentence, the lower curl of the scroll growing thin and short as he neared the end. Val and Cody were lost in their own thoughts. Only the executioner noticed Haille and Adamantus gallop into the main yard. The man in the hood was not ready for the sight of Haille, brandishing Elkhart in the morning light on the back of an elk whose antlers gleamed like swords. But before he could sound an alarm, Haille cleared his throat, knowing his next words, his shout, his interruption, would be the very fulcrum that all the coming events would turn upon.
"Commandant Marsh, I am Prince Haille Hilborn of Antis, son of Talamar Hilborn and Erzole Pascal. I call your authority corrupt and at an end. I challenge you to single combat for the lives of my friends and to defend your honor."
The soldiers broke formation and turned to Haille, then the commandant, his eyes wide and white in his ash-covered face. He crushed the ends of the sentencing scroll in his fist. Val and Cody looked as shocked as he.
"I hope you know what you were doing,"
the elk said to Haille over his shoulder. Haille spun Elkhart in his hand, a show of bravado he did not necessarily feel.
"It's what Yana once told me. Turn an enemy's strength into a weakness, and you can win the day." "Wise words in theory, but in practice he still may be many times your match."
The elk was right, and Haille knew it. So far, his sudden appearance, escaped from the dungeon riding on an elk, had had its intended effect. All eyes were trained on Haille and Adamantus. Now it was time to build on the drama of the moment. Haille spurred Adamantus forward. The soldiers parted for them as they rode up to the foot of the stage. Haille did not like surrounding himself with the commandant's men, but if all went according to plan, he would only be facing the commandant himself.
"What is this mockery?"
Marsh growled.
"It is you who make a mockery of justice with your twisted notions of honor. Your daughter's blood is on your hands,"
Haille said, throwing fuel on the fire.
"You dare.
Do you meet my challenge, or no?" Haille asked. He felt Adamantus' muscles tense beneath him. In answer, Marsh threw off his black robe. Beneath, he had dressed for the occasion in his most resplendent armor. Greaves, gauntlets, breastplate, and hauberk shone golden in the rising sunlight. Haille stifled a gulp and cursed inwardly as Marsh made for the stage steps and stretched out his hand. One of his men brought him his weapon of choice, not a sword, but a spear, with long blades on either end and serrated crossguards where each blade met the shaft. For the first time, Haille saw the smallest of smiles creep into the corner of the commandant's mouth, a thin worm of satisfaction twisting on his face. Haille knew the challenge was accepted. He knew the protocol as well, patting Adamantus on the neck and sliding down from the elk's back, his own legs shaking as he stepped onto the grainy earth of the main yard.
"There will be no mercy, no clemency, no matter who you claim to be, brat,"
Marsh said, his teeth flashing yellow in his blackened face.
"You forfeited that when you challenged my honor."
Haille had no words for a response. Instead, he squared off with the commandant, stepping into the center of the clearing formed by the soldiers. Marsh spun his spear shaft in the air, the blades making a low whistle. "I've backed myself into my own corner." No sooner had he thought so than Marsh launched his attack, swinging the spear shaft down at Haille, a reaper ready to scythe away a sheaf of wheat. Haille reacted, catching the blade squarely with his sword, but he had no counter except to retreat when the commandant spun the other end of the spear shaft at him, the bladed crossguard just missing Haille's shoulder. Haille immediately realized his disadvantage. Facing such a weapon, wielded by an experienced adversary, was like facing two swords with one. I don't stand a chance. The commandant's next attack was similar, a strike with one end of the bladed staff, followed by a swing with the other, then another with the original end. It was not long before Haille's left shoulder was sliced open and bleeding, and his clothes dirty from ducking and rolling away from the onslaught of strikes. For a moment, the commandant changed his attack, charging in with the end of the spear like a lance. Haille dodged once and twice, and just when he was falling into a rhythm, the commandant swung the spear low at his thighs. It was too late to duck, so Haille leapt over the swing. The commandant used the same attack again, and Haille realized it was not meant to harm him yet, but rather to expend his energy and tire him. It was working. Haille knew he had to change his attack, shift some advantage to himself. The next time the commandant charged, Haille struck the shaft to the side and moved closer in. Marsh was ready for him, jabbing the crossguard out like a dirk for Haille's gut. Haille pivoted, slipped, rolled with his own momentum out of the way just as the blade came down and gouged the earth in his wake. As the commandant did so, however, he overreached, and Haille knew he had to make the best of the opportunity. He swung Elkhart out at the commandant's lower leg and left a gash in his boot with a red, bloody wound inside it. But it was not enough to slow Marsh. The commandant moved in again. Haille backed up against the stage, then darted away from the next attack. He ran into the crowd of soldiers who parted for him, and parted even further for Marsh, who stalked him through the yard. Haille's shoulder left a trail of blood on the ground. There was no more delaying. This was the end game. Haille could feel it. He moved with his back to the soldiers facing the stage. Marsh strode forward, sweeping his weapon in great arcs that Haille unartfully parried, Elkhart dropping heavily between strikes. Haille was fighting for breath. One of the blades nicked his brow. Blood was weeping, trickling down his face. Marsh showed no mercy. He was a butcher, readying himself for the final blow. Haille ground his heels into the earth. He knew there was no yielding. No grace would be granted. He raised Elkhart a last time, positioning his field of vision so that he could see Marsh approaching, the stage behind him, soldiers absorbed in the contest, Val and Cody waiting, watching, horror on their faces, all oblivious to the shadow of the windlass cage passing above and dropping down onto the stage behind them. The cage crashed with a great thud of wood on wood, the excess cable looping into a pool beside it. The impact jarred Gunther, who had ridden inside it, to the floor, but he recovered himself, rose to one knee, and pounded the ground with the heel of his hand. A howl rose like a coming storm, even though the sky remained clear. The curtain wall trembled, loose mortar dropping out from between the stones, just before a rush of wind blasted the entire courtyard. The whole crowd of gathered soldiers and the combatants were knocked into the air and onto the ground. Even Gunther himself was thrown to the edge of the cage by the whirlwind he had called down. The soldiers holding Val and Cody fell to the edge of the stage. The captain and his friend wasted no time. Although their hands were bound, they rolled to their feet and ran into the cage. Once aboard, Gunther slammed the door behind them and signaled to Chloe at the controls to hoist them up. The courtyard was blanketed in a cloud of dust. Adamantus, the only figure left standing in the gale wind, galloped up beside Haille, picked up his collar in his teeth, and flung him onto his back. Haille grabbed hold of the elk's fur with his free hand and parried a spear thrust with Elkhart in the other. He braced himself as the elk sped across the yard to the stone steps leading to the battlements. Chloe was moving the cage overhead as quickly as the mechanism would allow, but it was not fast enough as the soldiers began to reform ranks and load their bows and arrows.
They need more time, Haille said. We'll grant it, Adamantus said, charging back away from the steps into the waiting ranks of the soldiers. The sight of Haille astride such a beast sent some running. Those that stood their ground found themselves hurled into the air by Adamantus. Others who tried to outflank them, Haille met with Elkhart, the sword singing with each crash of arms. The blood from the cut over his eyes was draining onto Haille's neck, wetting his collar. His shoulder was burning, but he had fight left in him yet. Marsh was rallying his men, bellowing orders. Adamantus turned and charged the commandant from behind. Marsh, hearing their approach, spun at the last moment, but the game had shifted now. Met with an onslaught of antlers, he was forced to fall back, crying out for reinforcements. They came in the form of reconstituted phalanxes of soldiers, but Adamantus charged through like a mad boar. It took all the strength Haille had to simply hold on, while the elk scattered spears, tossed swords, and trampled down foolhardy soldiers. The yard was chaos. Haille could see the cage had reached past the wall and was riding downward to the waiting Swiftwind. "Time to leave," he cried out to the elk. The stairs to the battlement were blocked by a fresh assortment of soldiers who had formed a wall to cut off their escape. Closer by waited the steps, which led to the drum tower and the commandant's chambers. The elk galloped up the steps, leaping them 3, 4 at a time, while Marsh himself led the charge after them. Adamantus reached the double doors that 2 guards tried in vain to hold before he kicked them both to the ground. Hooves rang out on the stone floor, and Haille ducked a chandelier of candles as they passed through the entry hall. "Which way?" Haille cried, scanning the doors, most of which were too small for the elk and rider to pass through together. "The only place we know," Adamantus said, turning up another set of stairs and bursting into the commandant's chambers where they had met the day before. Haille dismounted once inside and locked the door behind them. He stepped out of the way just as the elk pushed a bookcase down against the door, books and folios flopping into the floor. Over it all watched the beatific face of Evangeline Marsh, impassive, alluring, her features lit bright by the rising sun. The door shuddered as an axe head hammered into it, its blade biting between boards and splintering the wood. "Well, I guess we succeeded in freeing our friends," Haille said. The door splintered further. A gap appeared through which he could see the snarling faces of soldiers. Adamantus moved to tumble a second bookcase down in front of the door, but it was just delaying the inevitable. They both retreated to the far end of the room, upended the commandant's desk, and positioned it as a barricade to stand behind. They took positions at either end. "We make for some fighting pair," Haille said. "You showed true honor and courage today, Prince Haille. Your father and friends would be proud." Haille could not reply as he felt something catch in his throat. The door splintered again and exploded open. Men rushed and tumbled over the fallen furniture, Marsh following close at their heels, brandishing his spear. "The boy is mine! The boy is mine!" he cried, making his way to the front of the melee, throwing his own men aside as he did. But he stopped at the edge of the attack, his eyes raised to his daughter above, his face gone soft, pleading. "No!" Haille could not imagine that he and the elk cut out so fierce a sight as to stop the mad commandant short. He looked to the elk and then back to the window, and the face at the center of all the strife, just before she shattered in a cloud of colored glass. A shadow swung behind the face, just before a wood strut slammed through her right eye, followed by joists and struts and the floorboards that made up the windlass cage. The shards of the window formed a sparkling menagerie of color, hovering, spinning in the air, a rainbow of razor-sharp edges that Haille shielded his eyes from. The shards flew into the room, causing all but the commandant himself to duck. Crimson gashes erupted on his face as glass lodged in his flesh. He did not seem to notice, as tears left tracks in the ash on his face, and his daughter was taken from him once more. Adamantus heaved the table up in his antlers and sent it hurtling down at their attackers.
It struck Marsh first and sent him tumbling into the mass of his soldiers. Haille pushed open the gate of the windlass and held it aside as the elk leapt aboard. He scrambled on, and even before he closed the gate, Chloe had swung them out away from the fortress, the mortared walls moving away, the sea sweeping into view below, and the wind whipping about them. Haille clasped a cage strut in one hand, Adamantus in the other. An arrow shot through the shattered remnants of the window, so Chloe, still at the controls, wasted no time pushing the machinery, its winches and weights to move them out of bowshot. The motions were quick and abrupt, and Haille felt an overwhelming sense of dizziness as he looked down on the swift wind and the other waiting ships, seagulls circling in the air between them, the sun glinting bright in the surf, smashing up against the foot of the cliffs. Chloe was alone at the end of the crane, and she looked over her shoulder as soldiers approached her position from the battlements. Haille read the concentration on her face as she ignored the coming threat and maneuvered them so they were just over the swift wind. "How will she?" Haille began just as the cage jumped and started to descend, the counterweight moving rapidly up from below. The soldiers were just short of Chloe now. She drew her sword, not to engage them, but to smash the levers on the controls, rendering them useless. The cage jumped again as they began to descend faster. Just as the soldiers were about to reach her, Chloe clambered up from the control seat through the struts of the crane arm, balanced on the ridge of its back, and began to run. It was no small feat to behold. She ran without fear, her feet coming into place, balanced on the main strut of the windlass, her hair flying, her sword flashing as she discarded it. No need for it now, as balance was paramount. Haille strained his neck upwards as they continued to descend, watching Chloe as she neared the end of the arm, took 1, 2, 3 last strides, and jumped into the air. He felt himself gasp watching her as she floated, beautifully, dangerously, helplessly in the air. But she was not without purpose. Her trajectory carried her within reach of the main cable, which she caught, her body swinging, legs wrapping around the thick line like a lover, arresting her fall. She rode now in the controlled descent of the windlass, Haille letting out a cry of triumph just before they splashed down into the water off the stern of the swift wind. Green-blue waves washed over both elk and rider, the cage sinking halfway in the choppy water. The excess cable clapped down all around them, and it was not long before Chloe splashed down along with it. She surfaced, gasping for air, the droplets of water sparkling in her braids like pearls in an ocean crown. Her face split with a wide smile as she breast-stroked over to the cage and opened it. "An escape for the songs," he said. "A plan for the ages," Chloe replied. "Not without some valuable improvisation," the elk said. Ruane's rangers tossed them lines over the stern of the Swiftwind and lifted Adamantus up in a fishing net. Dripping wet, he shook himself like a dog as per usual and splattered all gathered: Gunther, Caitlin, Chloe, Cody, and Val. Caitlin, having been lowered first to the Swiftwind, nearly knocked Haille off his feet when she hugged him. Victor Twenge was on deck as well, his expression difficult to read, as if he himself were still deciding how he felt about his abrupt change of sides. Val wasted no time, slapping Haille upside the head. "That is for rescuing me, and so is this," he said, embracing Haille, pulling him close to his chest. Cody was next, his eyes still wet with humility and sadness. But there was also joy and relief in them, plus something else. If Haille did not know better, he would have called it pride. "Nice work, young elk rider,"